I'm so pleased that this symposium is actually here and that we're really starting. And really pleased to have a very distinguished moderator who will take us through this exploration of Pro-Bucks Vermont years. Dr. Tom Benson, who's president of the Green Mountain College in Poultney, Vermont, is our moderator. He holds graduate degrees in philosophy and religion from Harvard and Johns Hopkins. And he is a student of and a frequent visitor to China. Matter of fact, he just came back from China a couple of weeks ago. And he holds a variety of leadership positions in national and international organizations promoting scholarly exchange and international understanding between China and the West. He's very well equipped to lead this discussion. And while we are exploring these Vermont years, I think it's important to note that we're all still learning here. I found out a tremendous amount about Pro-Buck in the last 2 years since this idea came upon me. And just as we've gathered here today with a lot of people who knew her, we're still learning things. So that's my disclaimer in case there's anything in your package that someone later says, well, no, it actually wasn't quite that way. So feel free to ask questions. All of the people on our panel were familiar with Pro-Buck in a variety of ways. So let me get to our introductions, and I'll start with Don Rogerson, who did the video that you saw this morning. Don is president of WMHT, not HMT, a TV station in Schenectady, New York, and he worked in 1993 to produce that video that we just saw. And by the way, the video will be shown this afternoon at 3:30 in its entirety if you do want to see it. And also if you give us a list of your names, if anybody's interested in getting a hold of a copy, we can do that too. Also, Jackie Breen is going to be one of our panelists. Jackie is from Manchester, Vermont. She co-owned a property up on Stratton called Stonehaunts and was Pro-Buck's neighbor and became her secretary and good friend. Phyllis Landon, to Jackie's right, is from Danby, Vermont. She came here from, I don't even have to read this because I know all you now. She came here from Pennsylvania with Pro-Buck in about '67 to work at Stratton Corner Store, and then also went to Danby along with Pro-Buck in 1969. Edgar Walsh, Pro-Buck's son, to my right, who is from Greenwich, Connecticut, another Harvard graduate. We have two Harvard guys here together. And Edgar oversees the literary estate of Pro-Buck, and he's a frequent visitor to Dorset. And actually, you were the first one I found, I think, when I started to do that. And he graciously agreed to be a part. To my left, Janice Walsh, who is Pro-Buck's daughter from Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And there's no relationship between Buck and Bucks County, is there?
No.
No, I get that question all the time. Janice is a graduate of Antioch College, and she's an occupational therapist by trade. And she talks often about her mother to groups and hostels and organizations. And Janice also has written part of the afterword to one of, was it?
I read all the afterword.
The afterword in the book about Carol.
Right.
Correct. To Janice's left, Carol DeLuise from Dorset and California as well. Carol was an actress in the Dorset Playhouse back in the 60s and 50s. I didn't think it was that long ago. Back in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. And Pro-Buck was in the audience on many occasions. So she then became involved in the Pro-Buck Foundation, and she was actually awarded the Woman of the Year
The Pro-Buck Women's Award
in 1988. Thank you. And Thomas Sung, who has traveled from Cleveland, Ohio, to be with us. He was a former Stratton property owner, an architect and a partner in Buckminster Fuller, Sando, and Zung. Okay. Architecture firm in Cleveland, knew Bucky Fuller quite well and introduced him actually to Pro-Buck. So without further ado, we'll start our panel, and then we'll take a break, probably about halfway through, a couple more directions. Please feel free to ask questions. That's really what this is all about. And thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to just ask that the panel here move chairs back in light of our microphone situation. It's a great sound system, but rather than trying to go up and down the table. Well, first of all, I want to express the gratitude I think everyone here feels to Kemet for her extraordinary vision in imagining this event and working with the Stratton Foundation to put this all together. It's really, she can't even hear this praise, so that's outside. So, but let's give Kimetta a round of applause. Barbara McCarty and the Stratton Foundation, who have hosted and really been the underpinnings for this whole thing, and Barbara Barber is here and her colleagues in the leadership of the foundation. This symposium and this weekend represents, as far as I can tell, the first time that the state of Vermont, citizens in and around Vermont, have focused on the life and achievements of truly one of the great people, America, one of the great flatlanders, to grace these beautiful green mountains, Pearl Buck. There are actually, as far as I can count, 3 Nobel laureates in literature who have lived some part of their lives in Vermont. If somebody can name a fourth, delighted. Does anyone here want to take a guess at who the 3 are? Pearl Buck, number 1, first and foremost.
Solzhenitsyn.
Solzhenitsyn and Edgar Kipling and Rudyard Kipling. Yes. So little known fact, the third to some, but of course his play. Now, as a result of what is being done this weekend, there will be dedicated tomorrow a historical marker over in Danby to Pearl Buck, and that's going to raise the consciousness and levels of understanding among school children, tourists, Vermonters, everyone of this extraordinary human being who spent pieces and parts of the last 23 years of her life here in Vermont. We're going to focus this morning with people here around to my right and left who in complex ways knew and interacted with Pearl Buck, most profoundly her son and daughter to my right and left. But others here as well have some extraordinary insights and stories to tell about Pearl Buck and their experience of her here in Vermont. The 23 years that comprise the time that from Pearl Buck's first coming to Vermont until her death in 1973 were a time of great drama in the United States and around the world. And we probably won't dwell on much of that drama. I think a lot of the interest here is more nit and grit. Pearl Buck in Vermont, what she did, where she lived. We'll be seeing some of those places later today, tomorrow. But we all know that Pearl Buck was first and foremost a citizen of the world, an extraordinary opinion maker, a leader, a person who didn't let any issue escape her attention that had impact on justice and on the human community. During those 23 years, 1950 to 1973, the Chinese Revolution resulted in the declaration of the People's Republic of China in 1949, in the fall of 1949, and she came here just months later in 1950. The Korean War, McCarthyism, the Kennedy period, the so-called Camelot and the assassination of Kennedy, the Civil Rights Movement, the dawn in many respects of the modern feminist movement with the Feminine Mystique being published, and Pearl Buck predictably reading the galleys and boosting Betty Friedan's book. The Vietnam War, back to China, the Cultural Revolution that racked China, Nixon's opening to China in 1972. Pearl Buck interacted with all of these events and many, many more in profound ways, with courage, with independent-mindedness, and with great vision. At some point, I suspect, in the conversation we'll have now and at other points during the weekend, her role as a citizen of the world and as a visionary will play a role. But it's fun, having hit the high notes now, it's fun to talk too about Pearl Buck on the ground in Vermont. And so much of this conversation will be about Pearl Buck here, what she did, where she lived, and so on. So it's a great pleasure then for me, as I said to someone, I feel kind of like a baseball fan in the clubhouse. I mean, I never met Pearl Buck, admired her all my life, I've read many, but by no means all of her 80 books. But this is a thrill for me. I'm not asking for autographs from these people, it would be too gross. But it's a thrill, and I'm sure it is for all of you. Let's start. Let us start in no special order. This is going to be informal, and some of you, I want you to jump in. If you're just burning with a story or a question, just raise your hand. This is going to be profoundly disorganized, and I hope fun and worthwhile. But the first question that I would put to these good people is what it was that brought Pearl Buck to Vermont in the first place in 1950. We know why a lot of us come here or stay here and so on. But what brought Pearl Buck to Vermont? Would you like to start on that, Edgar?
I'd like to thank all of you for being here. It's so nice to look around this audience and see so many faces that go back in my life and have touched my life in so many pleasant ways. We came to Vermont in 1950 at sugaring season I guess it was March, I cannot remember precisely. And we came because my father, Richard Walsh, had published a book on maple sugaring called The Maple Sugar Book, which is written by Scott Nearing. And the Nearings lived on Taylor Hill Road. And I had met them in the fall preceding our arrival here at my father's office in New York when there was a book publishing party for the Nearings. And they brought down samples of maple syrup and maple sugar, and somehow or other during the process of publishing the book, I suppose the Nearings very casually said to my parents, well, why don't you come up sometime? And as often happens to people who have property in Vermont, the invitation was taken up, and a part of the Walsh family arrived here. Now, Janice didn't come on that trip. It was the family in 1950 consisted of Richard Walsh, Pearl Buck Walsh, Janice, Richard, John, Edgar, and Jean. Some years later, a few years after that, Pearl Buck adopted two other children, Henriette and Diego. That's just kind of background of what the family was. But in 1950, we came over the valley. We were driven up by our chauffeur, Mr. Ottinger, and we were deposited at the Nearings. All, what does that make, 6 of us? Yeah. And Mr. Ottinger went back down to Manchester to spend the night, and then it began to snow. And an overnight stay with the Nearings turned into 3 long days of vegetarianism. However, Pearl Buck fell in love with the place instantly, and not in any small part because she had been informed that there was no ragweed in Vermont, and she suffered terribly from ragweed at our home in Pennsylvania. And the months of late August and September were agony for her. And when she heard that there was no ragweed, which was specific to her hay fever and allergy, she said, well, why don't I buy some land up here and build a small house where I can spend the summers? And she also began to think, well, it'd be a way to get the boys occupied. I can send them up here and put them to work. Well, that's how we first came here. And I'll let you pass it on to other people.
Well, thank you, Edgar. And Janice, you have some perspectives on that as well from one of the books.
Yes, I think, excuse me. The reason I didn't come up in 1950, at that time I had just finished college and I graduated from Antioch, and I was on my first job, so I was sort of not quite, I was still part of the family, but I was being much older than the rest of them. I was sort of independent at that time. I just recently reread her book, My Silver World, and in that, she did, at that time, she wrote that between sometime in the 1950s. That was the time that it was published in 1954. And that was the time that she had started to come up here. And I just felt it was interesting in her own words, what she had said about coming here. The landscape outside my big window this morning is a forest clearing, and beyond the pines and the maples, At its edge, green mountains rise in rounded peaks. Our simple house is the result of a plan, and the plan is the result of a mild revolt on my part. These American children of mine were growing up without knowing how to use their hands. On the farm, the boys rode tractors and fastened the milking machine to the cows. They sat on the combine and harvested the grain and called it farming. It is farming, of course, the American way, but I was dissatisfied with it. They had no touch with the earth direct, and I feel that there must be the direct touch, hands upon stones and earth and wood, in order that life may have stability. My own life has been spent in many places, but has not lacked continuity or stability, because everywhere I have made gardens and lived on farms and planted and harvested in the unchangeable turns of the season. And the houses people build nowadays, the old strong farmhouses in Pennsylvania communities, still stand, but I see bulldozers sweep them down as though bombs had fallen. And in their place, upon raw and bleeding earth, machines have built little metal boxes a few feet apart, and they are called homes, and 20,000 families crowd into them. When I saw them, I knew I wanted my children to know how to build a real house. We went to Vermont one spring to see maple sugaring by helping to make it. And while we were there, my revolt took sensible shape in a plan. Land covered with forest with sheep in the mountainside, a little more than $2 an acre. We bought some high acres far from the road, and the next summer upon an old clearing where a farmhouse had stood a century ago, the boys began house building under the direction of a Vermonter who knew how to do his job well. Thereafter, each summer, the boys went to the mountain and worked. Foundation walls and doors, a well-laid stone floor. These slowly came into being. The work was finished by a fine German workman whose passion for perfection was irritant and stimulus to the young Americans, but joy for me. For I despise shoddiness of handwork, believing it to be accomplished always by shoddiness of mind and soul. Slowly, slowly, the learning went on, and at last the house was done. And here we are in our mountain house. Water has to be carried from the brook. Lamps have to be cleaned and filled with oil. There will never be a telephone. I cook our meals on the fireplace and think it is the best way of cooking in the world. Around us, the forest will come and go. Squirrels and deer, sometimes bear. And we always watch for Brother Porcupine, who will eat his way through anything, especially enjoying rubber tires. The house has cost us a third of what the new metal boxes in Pennsylvania cost. And the boys now know how to build it for themselves. And the girls know how to keep the house anywhere and still be civilized. As for me, I have this big window, the fir trees, and the mountains, and blessed relief from Pennsylvania ragweed.
Thank you, Janice. The issue of the nearings, which has been, which Edgar touched on, is something that I've said to commend, and maybe others would be an interesting focus for a symposium down the way. There is another a story to be told about remarkable people who came to Vermont, Helen Scott Nearing. There is a series of houses that are part of the story here, and today we're going to be seeing some of these places that are important in the story of Pearl Buck in Vermont. I think what might be interesting to do is to ask Edgar again, and then I'm going to bring in others here on the panel to talk a little bit about the property and the sequence of acquisition of that property. I learned just from talking to the folks on the panel, some of them, that Pearl was very much involved in the design of these houses, or at least laying out very, very clear specifications about how high the windows were to be and so on. But I think it might be interesting to just get some reflections from the panel on the houses from and in the order in which they appear.
You have to cast your mind back 50 years and think what this place was like 50 years ago. The paved road ended over at Bromley, at the intersection of Route 30 and Route 11. the paved road down, there was no paved road down to Bonneville. The road was there. It wound a bit more than it does now, but it was dirt. And the access road, of course, didn't exist. There was Taylor Hill Road, which came over the hill and went down to Jamaica. But from the Taylor Hill Road back to the summit of Stratton Mountain, it was woods. There was nothing there. There was a logging road that ran in along the stream. And when Pearl Buck decided to buy property, she was told that land was pretty cheap. Well, how cheap was it in 1950? The house that you're going to see later today is right down here on the golf course. And I happened, when I was going back through some old files prior to coming here, I found the account book that Pearl Buck's accountant kept on the acquisition and of the initial property and the expenses that were involved in building the first houses. And it says here that 75 acres, the first 75 acres on the golf course, were purchased on April 4th, 1950 for $225. And that's about $2 an acre. And on June 2nd, they bought another parcel so that they came up to 150 acres, and that second parcel cost 400. So basically 150 acres on the golf course of Stratton Mountain for $625. However, you've got to remember salaries and everything else was much lower then. The labor that was eventually hired to help build her other properties here in 1952, people were earning $1.50 an hour. And we boys, when we worked on the property, were paid. We were paid about 25 cents an hour. And in here, there's an accounting for, I think, a number of weeks that we worked, and it was about $10 a week that we earned for working on the place. Well, we were sent up here, my two brothers and I, to work with a man named Vernon Slayson, who was a carpenter, a skilled builder, had formerly been a selectman in Bonneville. I don't know, does anybody here remember Vernon? I'm sure some of you do. Great guy. And David Hamilton, of course, one of our great old friends from up here. Vernon was hired to work with us in the first summer that we were here. They acquired the land in 1950. In the summer of 1951, we rented a red schoolhouse, which you may see, an abandoned one-room schoolhouse down in Taylor Hill Road. My two brothers and I lived there. The rent, we rented it from the Nearings. The rent was, we were to paint the interior and perhaps replace some of the rear windows. Now, the schoolhouse was a one-room schoolhouse with a wood-burning stove. There was a privy attached and a spring behind the house, and that's where we were to live in. Pearl Buck really wanted the three of us to learn how to rough it. She thought we had it too comfortably in Pennsylvania in our home with running water and lights and so on. And so we got up here and we worked with Vernon the first summer. And the first summer involved improving an old logging road that led into the house site. The house site that Pearl Buck picked was, and you're going to see it, it was a simple clearing in the woods, and in one corner of that clearing was an abandoned cellar hole with two large notched logs still remaining from a former farmstead that had been located in that area. And there was an apple tree and an old abandoned well. And I remember when we first got to this site, we walked in the road with my father and mother and Vernon Slayson and God, maybe there were a few other people. And we looked at the place, and Vernon said, because there's an apple tree here, it means it was habitation. We found the cellar hole and the old cabin, but who lived there, I don't know. But there was nothing else, nothing here. You look around today and see Stratton Mountain and there's development. It's hard to imagine that it was a howling wilderness. But it had been inhabited, and Jack Lightfoot, who lived just up the road on Taylor Hill Road next to the Nearings, said that he could remember farms back on Stratton before the turn of the 20th century. So there had been people here, but they vanished, and we were sent out in the wilderness. It was 1 mile from Taylor Hill Road into the house site. And the first summer, we spent our time improving the road, building a tool shed to store our tools, and digging a foundation and pouring it. My brother Richard single-handedly dug the entire foundation of Forest Haunt, which you will see. And at the end of the first summer, we had the foundation in and protected for the winter. We had a tool shed. We dug out some of the well. But among all these things, there's so many things I can remember. I don't want to take too much time here, but I remember Vernon Slayson dousing for water on the first time we went to the site. And I remember Pearl Buck looking very skeptical about the proposition that anybody could actually douse for water. And Vernon walked across the house site with a freshly cut apple switch. And he walked along and he stopped and the twig went down and he said, 3 feet down here you'll find water. And we had shovels with us, my brothers and I, armed. So we started digging. 3 feet down we found water. And then I remember Vernon walking with Pearl Buck while she held the switch and she felt the switch go down, and I tried it. And it was, I later read Kenneth Roberts' great book on water dowsing, which I could recommend to anybody here. Shall I continue on that?
You might want to just Jackie Breen's connection here to the early property.
I'll pass it to Jackie Breen. The Nearings, perhaps seeing the handwriting on the wall, the Walsh boys, sold out after the first summer we were there. We were very well behaved, actually.
I was not here.
But Jackie was here the second summer. When we came back the second summer, the Nearings had sold their place to Jackie and George Breen. And I can tell you some of the things I remember very well about the second summer we were up here with, and how the Breens welcomed us to the bosom of their family. We were frequent guests at their house. I think the Nearings found the Walsh boys a little rugged and unintellectual for them, and we didn't really go there too much. But you know, Scott Nearing was a hard man and a rabid communist and socialist and vegetarian. We found little in common. George Breen, on the other hand, I remember brewing up a batch of homebrew while we were there. And the bottles all exploded. We came back a year later. I'll tell you, I'll continue on the second year when George Wendland becomes involved with the story with his son Peter. And that summer was a little more interesting. The first summer we were here, I was 14 years old, and my brothers John and Richard were 15. So we didn't have any wheels. We were sort of trapped, so we had to work very hard. The second year, we had a Jeep truck that belonged to us, it belonged to my parents, and we were somewhat mobile. But the Breens were here, and maybe Jackie tell a little story of how they got here and some of their connections to Provo.
I don't want to say anything more about the Walsh boys. Okay, here I go. This close. I met Pearl Buck in my own kitchen. This was our first summer in Nearing's farm, which didn't have running water either, and we had electricity. It was very rustic, but very large and very beautiful. And it was our first summer there. And I was clearing the kitchen when I accidentally looked to the window on my left and saw this striking couple coming up the driveway. Did I do that? Edgar's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Walsh, otherwise known as, I always called her Mrs. Walsh, when they knew her grandpa. And they were visiting us. I didn't understand it very well. I thought they were visiting the Nearings, but the Nearings had left. So then they introduced themselves, and we had a wonderful 2 hours of talking about everything under the sun. And at the end of that 2 hours, I was Pearl Buck's secretary, and Green was her manager up here in Vermont. And those were 10 very exciting years. I can't tell you, I'm reliving it, you know, here. And I have to tell you one thing about that area, in this area, there are bears. And I would sugar and have to come up the road at night, and I could hear the bears howling. And I was very uncomfortable about that. So, because they were hungry sometimes.
They weren't vegetarians.
We were not vegetarians. We would jack deer to get along there. And in one time, my oldest son killed both a deer and a bear the same year. And I can tell you that a bear meat and deer meat, if you mix them together, best meatloaf you'll ever eat. So we grew all our own food, and we learned a lot from Pearl Buck. She was a lover of the land and a lover of life in every aspect that she ever loved life. She was impatient. She was shy. I better watch this thing here. And I enjoyed every minute of being in her presence. I was just learning, just by breathing, you just learn from Pearl Buck. She was not patient. Did I say that? You agree with me? Okay. She was very shy. But because of all the things that she did in this world. And I think that on top of everything else, she was not meant to do all these things, being that she was so shy and private. It must, and if I don't forget anything, I want to say one thing. It was no piece of cake being Pearl S. Buck. She was too aware of everything. There wasn't a thing that escaped her. And, well, I started to take we've got the correspondence up here in the woods, and the mailman came 3 times a week. I didn't type the manuscripts because I didn't have enough time, so they were sent down to Doylestown and also New York for the typing. And what came up to Vermont were the correspondence, all the letters, the fan letters that she received, and I was flabbergasted. She did not ignore one little postcard. She answered every bit of that correspondence. So we would talk. She would sit in the window, and you will see Mountain Haunt later today, and her desk was in the corner on the left-hand side, looking straight up at Stratton Mountain. And she always said it reminded her so much of China, and this is why I think she picked that spot for her desk. She designed that house. She decorated that house. And everything is Pearl S. Buck in that house up there. And the builder came from Peru, I think, or the London area. And one thing I remember, when everything was put together, and they walked in, and Mr. Walsh then was in the wheelchair. But she walked, I think so, yes, I believe so, years escaped me. And anyway, when she walked into the big room there, she said, she took a deep breath and she said, "It's just what I wanted." There was one thing went a little awry. It was a large room with a gray slate floor. And somehow, one of the workers got carried away on Valentine's Day. And he found a little piece of red slate, and in the form of a heart. And he cemented it in well, you know, she never missed anything, I tell you. So she did ask later on that maybe it could be replaced, and it was replaced. And other than that, everything in that house was the way she wanted it, and her taste, I don't have to tell you about her taste. And so anyway, it was exciting years, and most of all, learning years. And I don't know anybody that I admire more than Pearl Esba.
I'm going to ask here that if Janice wants to just contribute something concerning the houses and the property here in Vermont.
I don't know whether I can add anything more than what Edgar has said, because you were part of the building of it. As far as I know, I think the first summer that she was here, that she stayed with Valley-on. That's what I gathered before Forest Talk was finished, and before she actually got into building Mountain Home. I imagine you may have seen it, there's a little painting of it that I brought up from Pennsylvania that I had, because after she was established up in Mountain Home, then I bought Valley Home from her, and I had that for many, many years myself. I don't know what more to say than what everybody else has said as far as the...
Where the houses are located.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I know where they are, you know.
You want to do that? Sure.
Doesn't matter.
You're hearing the names of haunts, Mountain Haunt, Valley Haunt, Forest Haunt. And just to clarify for you as to where they are located here at Stratton, the first house that we built was Forest Haunt, the one I've touched on already. She subsequently acquired Valley Haunt, which is on, if you go down Taylor Hill Road, you come to a flat area, and there used to be a big beaver dam there, a big pond, and the road into that house, into Valley Haunt, was put across the beaver dam in a corduroy manner, and there was that area. And then she built what is called Mountain Haunt, which is on the hill, on the bottom of Pinnacle Mountain, directly across from Stratton. As I look out here, I can see through the windows, I can see the ridge that's Pinnacle. And those were the original three houses. Subsequently to that, she eventually bought the Breen's house that had been Nearing's house, and through George and Jackie Breen, began to acquire a lot of other land and property. And that is a complicated story that I don't really have a lot of information on.
Thomas was there.
Yeah, Thomas, do you want to?
Sure. I'm Thomas, and I'm an architect, and the way I got here is that our office was contacted by Sysosimo Lumber. Some of you people out there probably know. So Tony Sysosimo had me come over here, never say anything about Pearl Buffers, and just say, come on up, I've got some land that I'm acquiring, I want to do something with it. And we know that you as a firm have been very ecologically involved, being with Lucky Fuller. We cared a great deal about the earth. And at that time, unbeknownst to me, there was an act, some of you people probably know, it's the Act 250, and it was like impossible to get any kind of clearances. Anyway, Tony Sysosimo had me come in and look at it, and he says, oh, by the way, have you ever heard of Pearl's Buck? And I said, good, of course I've heard of Pearl's Buck. So why? He said, well, we're going to buy some of her land, and they're going to do something, develop it. And so that was the development of that area. And then about, this is incidentally the very late 60s, early 70s, Edgar talked about transferring land because I became a property owner with Tony for the Stratton Ridge project. We paid $3,000 an acre. And that was to Jack Lightfoot with the proviso that he would be able to live there for the rest of his life. You probably, people all know this, as you go down Taylor Hill Road going towards what we call the Sun Bowl, you call the Sun Bowl, Forest Pond is on the right-hand side, and we would call that the guest house. And so her property was on the left-hand side of the road, so a road actually separated Mountain Haunt and from Forest Pond. And then Tony, being clever, said, well, would you like to meet her? And I said, of course. And I met Madame Buck, as being Chinese. I always refer to her as Madame Buck. And then she was very concerned in what was going to happen to Forest Pond, the guest house. I kept on wondering why. And later I found out for several reasons. Number one, she had the boys build it. So it had something to do with this mother instinct. She wanted to be sure that we who had purchased the property were not going to desecrate it. So that was first. And then secondly, she wanted to leave a legacy that's made interesting this very important house in her career. And we had promised, we wanted to do it, by the way, that we would turn the house into a library and a meeting space so that people coming to Stratford, we called the project at that time Stratford, so that they could have a sense of history. And she also was very concerned that the whole tenor of the property would not be, as I could say, just little box houses. That would be something that was very much Vermont. And she, with I, talked about China, of course, and there's two great mountain ranges in China. One is Guilin, which is in southern China, that's on the River Li, and that looks like very much the paintings that most of you have looked at. The other one was where she grew up, and that is the Great Gorges. You now know it as the Three Dam Gorges that's being now dammed up in China. That is the mountain range area which reminded her so much of Green Mountains, which is where we are right now in China. In fact, if you blink your eyes and kind of look a little bit, Don, you know that, you were just there recently, it looks very much like this particular area. So all of that I thought was very poignant. And of course, Bucky Fuller also being a man of the earth and the world, a world citizen. And we'll talk about that after the break. There are a couple of things that Bucky Fuller and Madame Buck would talk about. I just want to close with a very interesting story, because after she found out I was Chinese, you know, I had the opportunity to talk with her, and she said, well, I want to practice our Chinese. Where were you born? I said, I was born in Shanghai, China, but I came over at a very young age, 4½. And she said, well, let's practice Chinese. So she talked to me some things in Chinese, and I tried to answer her back. Well, my Chinese is not that great, and so she said, in a very nice way, and the way she said it was that which in translated means, your Chinese is terrible. It hurts my ears. And then she looked at me, and I nodded more places, but you're easy to look at. So I got a nice kiss from her. Oh, you get a kiss by Bill Valornia.
You just mentioned that Don had been in China recently, and we had talked earlier about the missionary retreat that the Nanjing, or Nanking as it was called, area Protestant missionaries would go to in the summer to cool off and have a retreat, and that's Lushan. And were you there, John?
Yeah. You've asked me to lean forward so that we can get it for wherever we're going to broadcast it. Really, almost the only thing I think I should comment on here for you is I was looking out the window, and as we were talking, found some of this discussion of the folks who really knew Pearl Black just fascinating myself, I think, like you are. But I looked out, and I did have a chance to go to Lushan, and the missionaries did go into the mountains up the Yangtze River because it was so hot in the summer, and the families would often go to this pretty famous place called Lushan. In fact, both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao kept houses there. And but the missionaries went there first, and they were missionaries from places like West Virginia, as Pearl Buck was from, or other parts of the East usually, and the missionaries congregated there. And it does look a little like Vermont, with the streams, with the greenness. And I remember when I went, it was summer, we went up these mountains, and suddenly it was cool, and there were streams, and there was this feeling. And when Edgar and Janice were talking about coming up here and why she came up with the hay fever, it just really touched me that that was a piece of it. So,
in the interest of time here, we might, is Kemet somewhere here? I'm thinking, do people want to just stand up for a minute and stretch, and then we'll go for just a little bit more. I want to focus next on, okay, Okay, let me just say that in terms of agenda, looking ahead here, we're going to turn in the last part of this conversation after Edgar's comment, which is apropos, I'm sure. We're going to just do a little bit about what some of the things Pearl Buck did here in Vermont, and I want to bring some of the other panelists in respect to her work habits, her getting over to the Dorset Theater to see Carol on the boards and so on. But I'm going to have Edgar make his comment, and then I think we'll just stand up for a minute and stretch. What, Kim?
Just a 3-minute break.
Yeah, 3-minute break, and then we'll come back for just a little bit more to turn the corner and talk a little bit about the pattern of her days here. Edgar.
I think many of you sense in hearing from us here that thousands of people knew Pearl Buck, and each one of them thinks they know Pearl Buck. And it's like the blind man and the elephant. Everyone can tell you what Pearl Buck was like. And that's one of the fascinations of this woman. And it made her difficult to live with sometimes, but you'll hear more of that. But I wanted to offer those of you who might care to a little treasure hunt when we get down to forest haunt, because I'll jump ahead to the second year when we were here, my brothers and I. We were working on completing the house, and we were painting, we were pointing with cement on the exterior walls of stone. And on a hot August day, I said to my brothers, I think we ought to put our initials on this house. And if you care to look, you can find, I have lost my initials. They're somewhere on the house. I found my brother Richard's initials. You see RW52. If you want to look for it, go ahead. It's hard to find, but it's there. And John and I have our monograms there, but I don't know where they are. They may have been over-pointed. Somebody may have cemented over them in later years. But I look forward to seeing you all down at the house.
Let's just, yes.
Can I ask one question before we move on from that? Your mother had an intention for you to learn a certain thing when you came here. What did you learn when you came here and built that house?
What was the question? Is what did you learn? Pearl Buck wanted you guys to often learn the essentials.
I think she wanted us to learn that life is hard, and that Americans have it easy, and that most of the world lives the way we live in a one-room schoolhouse, hauling water. And fortunately, the water we had to drink was good water. Most of the world has no good water. She wanted us to appreciate that, and Forest Haunt was, as Janice read you, was built to be a very rustic house with no running water, no electricity, cooking on the fireplaces. There are fireplaces at each end of a 50-foot long room. And the first summers we were there, that's how we lived. And I have memories of Pearl Buck bent over the fire stirring a pot. And that changed when Richard Walsh became ill. He had the summer I was 16, we all went on a trip out west, and he had the first of a series of strokes which eventually crippled him and killed him. And in the early years of that illness, the house, Pearl Buck decided the house was too uncomfortable for him, and so she had electricity brought in, we drilled a well, and so forth. And all the houses were made comfortable so that Richard Walsh could use them.
Were you going to say something?
I think also when I look back on it, when I think about her life in China, and of course I was there with her for the first 9 years of my life, there are periods in her life in which this is how she was brought up. Especially after her first marriage, where she went to a very desolate part of China, and she had to learn how to do these things. And I think she always felt that we should be able to take care of ourselves in any situation, and it was important to her and for us to learn these things. And I think we've all benefited, I know I have, from that learning. So I think that was important to her too.
Thank you, Janice. Let's just stand up for a couple minutes here, just to stretch, just a little bit more. other stories to be told, and so I hope this project of the continuing discussion about Pearl Buck and those who knew her and worked with her here will get gathered together somehow or other. Edgar.
A question that somebody put to me during the break makes me want to perhaps just review very quickly for those of you who are not familiar with Pearl Buck's life, how she what became Pearl Buck, if you will. Her maiden name was Seidenstricker. Her father was a missionary in China. She married John Lossing Buck, and John Lossing Buck and Pearl Buck had one child, Carol, who was mentally retarded and was institutionalized from the time she was 10 until she died some years ago. Buck and the two Bucks adopted Janice when Janice was an infant. When Pearl Buck wrote The Good Earth, Pearl Buck's first novel was East Wind, West Wind. It was sent to New York and to an agent. It circulated through 40 publishers. They all rejected it until it landed on the desk of a publisher named Richard Walsh, who had a company called the John Day Company. Walsh agreed to publish East Wind, West Wind. It didn't do very well, but Buck's second book was The Good Earth, and the rest is history. After the publication of The Good Earth, Walsh and Buck met. They had not met prior to the publication of The Good Earth. And they fell in love and married. They divorced their spouses and got married. Pearl Buck did not have any more children of her own, and she wanted a family. A year after the Walshes married, they adopted John and Richard. And a year later, they adopted Edgar and Jean. As I mentioned earlier, some years after that, Chieko and Henriette. So that's that. I wanted to talk a bit. David Hamilton mentioned something during the break about how Pearl Buck ran things. As you can imagine, just seeing this panel, she had a vast circle of acquaintances, and she had a large family and a large staff of people to help her run things. And she ran her family and her businesses in the Chinese manner, I might say, in which everyone is to inform on everyone else. As an example, when I was in college, and I used to come up here with my friends and use the Forest Home property. One winter, we decided that we would keep a record of our beer drinking, and as we drank cans of Budweiser, we stacked them on the mantelpiece and on the rafters. And we came up, some of my college buddies and I, about half a dozen times during the course of a winter, and we had a magnificent beer can selection. And we also, because it was totally deserted here, we would go out in the snow with shotguns and throw beer cans in the air and fire at them as they were sailing along, and we were all pretty good shots. At the end of the winter, we cleaned up, Pearl Buck didn't come up during the winter. At the end of the winter, we cleaned up all the beer cans, but we missed a few out in front of the house, and David Hamilton had to clear it up. And Pearl Buck asked David, well, how did the boys behave? And he reported on the vast beer consumption. I still have the letter advising me to visit AA.
Edgar just noted that Pearl Buck did not come up in the winters. Her period here was generally, as I understand, from the beginning of the ragweed, whatever season in the spring, till frost. Though there was property on the Jersey Shore, and of course in Pennsylvania, so it wasn't non-stop here, but significant sections of the summers from 1950 to 1973, she would be here. Now, while she was here, we know that the prime appeal was an opportunity to be away from the madding crowds and the life in more populous area, and time to write and to be in the countryside. But she did involve herself here in some community and cultural affairs and events, and one of those was to go from time to time to the Dorset Theater. And it was there that our panelist, Carol DeLuise, met her. And as you know from the introduction from Kemet, years later, 1988, Carol, by virtue of her service, won the Woman of the Year Award from the Pearl Buck Foundation. But I'd like Carol to just say a little something about her encounter with Pearl Buck over at the Dorset Theater.
Right after that great honor of being awarded the Pearl Buck Women's Award in 1988, I came right to Vermont because we own a house here in Dorset, and I have the award sitting right on the front mantelpiece in our home. Upon graduation from the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, I received a scholarship to the Caravan Theater at the Dorset Playhouse. And I thank God for that, because here I was in Vermont, and many, many performances were attended by Pearl Buck, who loved the theater. And one particular year, I think it was around 57, and our coincidence, the business manager of the Caravan Theater, Susan Richardson, was also the child of missionary parents, and she was born in China. And that particular play that year was an original written by Hank Murray over in Dorset. He was the husband of our set designer. And Susan's idea was to ask Pearl Buck if she would come and review that particular play. And she made an appointment to see Pearl Buck at her home, and we talked about it. It was probably Mountain Haunt that she visited at that time, and she had the appointment, and she spoke of asking Pearl Buck to come and review it. And at first she resisted. She didn't want to wear the hat of a critic because she herself was a writer. But because of the subject matter, it was about the United Nations, she did agree, and I happened to be in that play. So I did briefly meet her after that performance, and that was a great thrill that I still have that review in print that in my scrapbook at home. After years, though, I realized that she had formed this foundation to help the Amerasian children, and that made a great impression on me, because she talked about these children who were not wanted, probably the most needy children in the world, because they weren't wanted in their own land. They were wanted nowhere. They were the forgotten children. And she said, these children exist, and the American government said they didn't exist. And she said they did exist. And she did something about it. She formed the foundation. Well, my husband and I became sponsors over 25 years ago of a child in the Philippines. And we have been sponsors ever since of different children over the many years. I won't go into all of that, but the great pleasure when I heard David say the wonderful thing was working for her, to know that she chose Vermont to come to. I guess I've never been grateful for anybody suffering from ragweed before, but she came to Vermont. So that's all I'll say right now.
It's known here from the film, the videotape, Don's wonderful work and so on, that Pearl Buck spent just a little bit over half of her life in China. And she made a point of that often, I think. I don't know, proud of that fact. She spent a little bit over a quarter of her life here in Vermont. I mean, if you think of the 50 to 1973, but again, it was parts of those years. While she was here, she engaged in her primary activity of writing, and two of our panelists have somewhat of a window on that, Jackie and Phyllis, the work habits and patterns, and I wonder if you'd like to just comment a little bit about the discipline and the work pattern. Now, you've already said something about that, Jackie, but if you want to contribute something more, and then Phyllis, who also worked with her.
Phyllis.
I worked with Pearl Buck in Pennsylvania, and my husband worked with Pearl Buck in Pennsylvania. And Pearl Buck came to Vermont and wanted to buy a country store in Bonneville, which she did, and she asked my husband and I to run the store for her. And then they decided, she and her associates, to buy another country store in Danby and ask us if we would run that. Well, on the third floor of that country store is where Pearl Buck would do her writing, and she would look out over to Mount Tabor and think and dream of her mountains in China. And she was very disciplined, as you say, and she was very gracious as far as autographs. She would sit in the country store and people would come and she'd autograph their books for them, and just loved everybody, a wonderful woman. And when we came to Vermont, I had a younger brother who was in a Salvation Army home. And when Pearl Buck found out about that, she said, "What?" She said, "Here I am taking care of all these children and caring, and you have a brother in a home?" And she said, "You get him out of there. You use my name if you have to." And I did. And I'm very grateful for Pearl Buck's help in that. I'm very grateful for my association with Pearl Buck. She just was a wonderful woman, and I'm glad I knew her. Thank you.
I don't know.
Marie?
Oh, yes, it was.
What year was that store in Bonneville started?
Oh, the store in Bonneville was 1967. And then we went to Danby in 1969. And the hopes were to have a ski area there on Dorset Mountain, and to have the antique center and an import-export business. And that was called the House of Miscellanies. And they had many, many dreams. And they also had a youth group and did things for the youth in the town. Did a lot of things.
Sure, really quick. The person who just asked that question is Marie Miller, who worked really closely with me, but with the Pearl Buck Foundation for many, many years. And Marie, I've told somebody from the foundation itself is here, but at some point we ought to let you know more, if you don't already, about the Pearl Buck Foundation in Pennsylvania, which does this great work that Carol, Thomas, Janice was head of, and I just wanted to jump in to get a little plug in for the foundation somewhere along the line. We have to know some more about that.
One more thing, Pearl Buck also has an adoption agency and called Welcome House, and that was wonderful too.
Okay. Jackie, were you going to?
I just wanted to say that Pearl Buck was involved in this group early on in the 50s, hoping to develop Stratton Mountain. And she was all for recreation.
Edgar?
Do you all think that she, in light of that, all this development would be pleasing to her?
The question is whether or not all of this development here would be pleasing. We know it wasn't pleasing to the Nearings, who fled to Maine. But the question is, would this be pleasing? And I guess Edgar and Janice, if you want to respond to that, Janice, would this development have been?
I think Edgar would be
Since Pearl Buck was always interested in making money, whether from her books or I think she might have enjoyed it. And she did make money, thanks to George and Jackie Reed, really. They were her advisors and counselors and all that. I wanted to talk very, very briefly about Pearl Buck's work habits. And I would say that I have never, in my life, ever met anyone as mentally disciplined as Pearl Buck and as disciplined in her work habits, whether in Vermont or in any of our other houses. She had a regular routine. She got up at 6 in the morning and went and did her creative work at her typewriter. In the years, her original manuscript she wrote longhand, but she worked at a typewriter for her creative work. And then in the forenoon and the afternoon, she did her correspondence. She answered all her fan mail personally. She wrote articles and so on. She did that in the afternoon, and in the late afternoon, she would indulge in family and gardening and pleasurable things. But this was her daily routine from the time she adopted me in 1937 until almost until the time she died. And she never took vacations in the way that most of us think of a vacation. Let's go somewhere and go skiing, let's go and relax, because she always had 6 books in train in her mind. And she knew exactly what those books were going to be. She could tell you, when I finish this one, I'm going to write a story of blah, blah, blah. And it was absolutely remarkable to listen to her, as all those of you who had the good fortune to know her, to appreciate a highly disciplined and organized mind. And I've never met anyone in my life again similar to her. And I'll just mention in closing here very briefly, I've had the pleasure in the last couple of years of pushing the development of a film of her book, Pavilion of Women. I'm going out to Los Angeles on Monday to screen it. It's been 4 years in development, and it should be released by Universal sometime later this year. I'm also going to be talking about the development of several other film projects. We're seeing a very great interest in it. I expect that maybe we'll if we get around to, as we're talking about, doing a TV miniseries about her life, that we may actually do some filming up here. I'd like to see that.
We want to have the screening of that when that comes. We want to be the place for the first screening of that miniseries.
We want the first screening of the Pavilion of Women here, world premiere, clean lights.
I've been still thinking.
Go ahead, Jen.
If you're wondering where she got all the energy, she took ginseng every day. But also, she was very nutrition conscious. She believed very strongly in good nutrition, so that I know. But the ginseng, I never got to it.
We boys, there was a report sent in by somebody after our first summer in here that we had fed ourselves on canned food all summer long. And junk cereal from the Bonneville market, but I don't know how we got there.
I'm going to ask Janice to comment on Pearl Buck's work habits and so on.
Actually, I think that in reading some of her books, I realized that I think she got her work habits mainly from her parents. Her father, of course, was a very staunch, stable man, and I think he believed in what he was doing. He had very set ways and rules of how he was going to go about his work. And I think her mother also was somewhat similar in that way. So this is the way she was brought up. And I think that she just capitalized on that and just continued that for all of her life. And she felt that that was the way to do things. Also, I would like to mention one thing. As you know, in the back there is one of her nieces, the daughter of Al Walsh, who was Richard Walsh's brother.
Would you stand up, please? Joyce? Would you stand, please?
So there's one more member to the family here. I just wanted to mention that. Yeah. Jackie and Joyce and I used to have a lot of fun in the summertime, especially when they would come down to Pennsylvania. And I often wonder what happened to them. I'm so glad to see her.
So we'll have a chance to mix and over lunch and so on, so it'll be delightful for people to talk with. Is there a question here?
Yeah, are you children bilingual?
I do not speak Chinese, but I speak French, Spanish, Portuguese, German.
Janice?
When I first came to this country, of course, I spoke both Chinese and American. However, when you're at 9 years old and you're trying to go to learn what it is to be an American in America, you don't really speak Chinese, and I refused to speak it, which I now regret, but I didn't, yeah. Because when you're in China, you learn both languages and you intermix them completely, and there's no, you just don't realize that there's any difference. You just know when to speak Chinese, when to speak English.
I gave her the same excuse, and she didn't buy that one. I gave her 4.5. Now, the one thing I wanted to mention is being Chinese, my own background. I really do think that Pearl S. Buck was Chinese on the inside, totally. I mean, her discipline, her work habits, even the way she brought the children. I think Edgar mentioned that the Chinese way is to go get information from everybody. In fact, I've always thought in terms of if you really want to know the inside Pearl Buck, read Imperial Woman. That's a really, I mean, that goes to all the intrigue. But she was very, very disciplined. I don't know how many of you probably have heard about it. How many Asians do you know that takes a vacation? They don't. You know, we don't take vacations. I mean, this is something that's not brought up in our culture. And so working very hard with her background, and then living in China, missionary parents, it was just part of her just giving that. I had the privilege of being Bucky Fuller's partner. Same thing. Bucky never took a day off. I mean, that's unthinkable to Bucky to waste time, you know.
Thomas, I have
Yes,
a
Carol.
question. Maybe, Thomas, you could talk about the story that Valerie Harper told me yesterday about Pearl
Yeah,
Buck's
I
assessment of your
mentioned, I
Chinese.
mentioned to them that she didn't buy that. My Chinese wasn't very good.
I'll just say something briefly because you were talking about her writing. Janice's touched on it. I read in 3 different books that it was her mother who always encouraged her to write. And she wrote when she was a very, very young child. I mean, that there were things published when she was 7 and 8 years old. You know.
It's a question in the back, yes.
Could you comment on how many drafts she would do for manuscript, and also the fate of the work in the hands of the editors?
Okay, did everybody hear the question? I think we'll ask Edgar and others who may want to jump in on that.
I of course saw her at work mostly in our home in Pennsylvania, and there was a wonderful, if you will, production system for Pearl Buck. She sat in one office writing. My father sat in the office immediately adjacent to her editing, and the pages flowed from Pearl Buck to her editor and then to the public, and it was a marvelous system, and she did not, because, as I mentioned, everything in a story was in her mind, and she was such a craftsman as a writer that this story would flow directly onto the page and did not need editing. Richard Walsh could amend it. He would make suggestions as to style or as to whether a book was appropriate and so on, but he did not need to edit in the sense of proofreading and correcting grammar or paragraphs or whatever. She had it all framed out. That is remarkable. It's not unique, of course, to great writers. I always often think of the story I was told when I was in college about Ford Madox Ford, who wrote The Good Soldier in English, and he was absolutely fluent in French. And when it came time to translate the book for his French publisher, he translated it without referring to the English version. He wrote it in French, and you can read those 2 volumes, and they're identical. The paragraphs. So Pearl Buck probably could have done that into Chinese, but obviously totally different.
We're going to have a brief chance after lunch this afternoon to meet it'll be a rather brief period, but when we can deal with more questions and conversation. I do want to say that one important theme that I would like to touch on when we come back this afternoon is the poignant story of Pearl Buck's desire to go back to China and her unsuccessful attempts to obtain a visa from the Chinese government. It's said that there are many explanations for that very, very draconian and deeply disappointing decision on the part of the Chinese. One of the explanations that Peter Kahn retails in his cultural biography of Pearl Buck is that The Good Earth was translated poorly into Chinese. At least one translation into Chinese was done very poorly. And Lu Xun, who is probably the most revered writer in the pantheon of the Chinese communist regime, but a great writer beyond the Chinese communist estimations, he read it and felt it was absolutely third-rate and so on. And it's felt that owes largely to the poor translation. But at any rate, that issue of her desire to get back to China is something that I'd like some of our panelists to reflect on what that meant to her, that last sadness. We're going to, where is Kemet, who is the, Kemet. You're going to announce what's next.
A couple of housekeeping chores, and thank you so much. That was really outstanding. I just wanted to let you know that our esteemed Governor, Howard Dean, regrets he couldn't be here with us today, but he did declare formally Sunday, June 25th to be Pearl S. Buck Day in Vermont. So tomorrow, it's actually the day before her birthday, which would have been the 26th of June. So we are going to be in Danby, Vermont tomorrow. For those of you who would like to join us, we'll meet there at 9 to see a video that was done in Danby. And at 9:30 have a dedication of a historic plaque that's going to be erected in Danby that came from the state of Vermont, acknowledging Pearl Buck's contributions to the state and to Danby. So we'll do that at 9:30, and then a walking tour of the home she owned in the Danby area, and then a brunch. So if you are interested in doing that, please join us tomorrow. We only really need to know if you're coming for brunch. Be sure to check with Barbie McCarty so we have an accurate count. That's tomorrow. At this point, what we're going to do is gather as many as we can take in our big white Stratton bus, go right down to Forest Haunts, where Edgar, we're going to try to find your initials. And then we'll be there for about 10 or 15 minutes. We have some cold drinks there, and then we'll head over to the Stratton Mountain Country Club for lunch. And then we will leave the country club probably about 1:30 to visit Mountain Haunts, the main house, and then Valley Haunts, the house that Janice owned. And then we'll come from Valley Haunts back here for about a half an hour wrap up, and then we will also show that Danby video that runs about 25 minutes here back in the theater. And then that'll conclude today's presentation, unless you would like to then stay for the full 85 minutes of Don Roberson's video, which we'll do at 3:30. So if we can get as many folks as possible onto the bus, and then maybe some of you who might have a station wagon or a big car, do a couple of carpools and just follow the bus. It's about a 5-minute drive from here. Thank you.
And then I think what we'll do is go on, as was suggested, to see the videotape that from the Vermont Public Television Archives. But I want to say that Thomas Zung, whom you met this morning on our panel, a distinguished architect from Cleveland who knew Madame Buck, as he calls Pearl Buck in the classical sense, has another dimension of interest, or holds another dimension of interest for many of us, and that is he was a partner in this architectural work of Buckminster Fuller. And there was a great natural resonance, some kind of a spiritual resonance or connection, I think, between the visions of Pearl Buck and Bucky Fuller, both citizens of the world, both people with their eye on the future, and a boundless sense of responsibility and commitment to a better world. So I'm merely calling this wonderful connection and this background that architect Thomas Zung has to your attention, so that during the break or at the cocktail hour reception tonight, you'll seek out, as I already have, Thomas Zung to find out more about Bucky and Pearl Buck. They never met, but they might as well have for all the points of connection. And Thomas is just back from a symposium, June 16th and 17th in London, on Bucky Fuller and the art of design science. So do seek out Thomas on that. Then finally, I want to introduce Lynn Jarvis, who is where? Lynn Jarvis, who, and will Lynn say something about this?
Yeah. And I think we maybe should ask about any questions.
Okay, fine. So before Lynn comes to the microphone here, Lynn incidentally is from Vermont Public Television.
I was at the time. I'm now at UVM.
He's now at UVM. But I knew him, and we had an interview in his days with Vermont Public Television. The video you're going to see, those of you who stay to watch this 20-minute production, Lynn will say something about. But before I give this to Lynn, let us do what Kemet said, and that is see if there are any questions. I know Edgar, for example, is the literary executor of Pearl Buck's estate. So the whole question, I've been asking questions about books in and out of print, plans for republication. He mentioned the film that is in the works. You're off to California on that. And then so many, Janice here, we were in her home just a few minutes ago, one of her places at the Valley Haunt. So are there questions here for a minute or two, or three? Oh, yeah.
What does the word haunt mean?
A dwelling place, the question is, what does the word haunt mean? And I think as Pearl Buck used it, might be a different dictionary definition of a quiet place away from the crowd, deep in the woods.
Is it Chinese origin?
I'm not aware of a Chinese connection there.
Tennyson. I come from haunt of coot and hern and make a sudden sound. Don't we all know that from the 6th grade?
Very good.
Deb, do you have anything on that? The question of the origins of the
No,
haunts?
I mean, it's absolutely, as Edgar said, it's quite close to
Yeah. Yes, there was another question.
Same question.
Oh, wonderful.
I think I heard her use the expression, the place you want to revisit, or to haunt, you keep going back. To her, that, I think.
There are other questions here from...
That's good.
Yes.
The film left you sort of under the bushes, or the next everyone was getting off the ship.
Well, I didn't quite understand it. You wanted to know how we got out of Nanking? Well, there were several times. One time we had to flee when I was only 2 years old. We had to hide for about that time. We had to hide for about 13 hours in a very, very small hut that belonged to one of the Chinese servants that my mother had. And at that time, my Aunt Grace was my mother's younger sister, and she had one son, Raymond, and her husband, Jess Yorkie, and that was my mother, my sister Carol, myself, and of course my father, Lawson. So we were hid there for about 13 hours or more, according to when I read the thing in my several worlds. It seems to have been a longer period of time. And as the Chinese Amma said, you know, if your children cry, I'll spank my child, and all children cry the same. So we were very fortunate not to have been spotted. And then later on, the Americans did start to come in, and they fired the gunboats on the Yangtze. And therefore, that sort of settled things down a bit. But from there, we went to the university, which Lossie was working at. And from there, the Americans were sort of centered in that Nanking University, and then from there, we did go to Japan for a year. And coming back, of course, we went to Shanghai first because the house had been looted. We were very fortunate again because many of her friends and Chinese friends especially, as well as servants, had pretended to loot the place and had taken many of her things back. So that when she came back, she had lost a lot, but I mean, there were many things that were saved. So it was about a year or so after that that we were able to go back. Does that answer what you wanted to know?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Other things?
Yes, I'd like to know how you obtain a copy of the video.
Don, your video.
If you'll just give me your name and address on a piece of paper, I'll write you a note or send you a postcard about it.
Okay. Other questions?
Have either of you returned to China? Gone back to
So
China?
you've gone back to China. Well, have you been to China and have you gone back to China?
I went, yes. I went back to China in 1988. At that time, I was involved with the Pearl Buck Foundation. I was president of the board, and it was the 20th anniversary of the founding for Thailand as well as for Manila and for the Philippines. So since I was that close to China, our executive director, who was Chinese, decided I should go back to China, so I got the visa and was able to go back in. So we went to Shanghai and then to Nanking, where I'd grown up, and I remember many of the places, and we had visited a lot of the different places from there. We went to Beijing, which I remembered many of those different places. So I did get a chance to go back. We went to Zhenjiang, which that's what it's called now, but at that time, that is what my mother always referred to her in her books as Xinjiang, and that's where she grew up. She taught at a boys' school there. We went back to the boys' school, and we met this very little tiny Chinese lady. She was over 100 years old, and she had been one of my mother's pupils. So it was very nice to meet her, and she remembered her. Her name was Pearl He. She was very nice. So, yes, I did get a chance to go back. And I was glad I did. I've never gone back since, but maybe someday I will.
I think we'll move to the video. Now, the good news is those of you who are staying, and I think many of you are, hope you are, will have a chance this evening to visit informally with the panelists. So I want to thank you again, Kimet, and this wonderful panel, and everyone here for your attention and questions and the like. So, well, now, Lynn Jarvis will say just something about this video.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon. I think you'll be interested in seeing this video. It was made in 1971. I was a very young producer for Vermont Educational Television at the time, and our program manager said, Pearl Buck has moved to Danby, Vermont. Would you try to organize a program with her? So I made a phone call and got a hold of Ted Harris, and he said, we might be interested, but you should come down and speak to Miss Buck. So my parents live in Andover, which is less than an hour from here, so the meeting was made for a Saturday evening. I drove down to my folks, and on that Saturday I picked up a friend of mine, Ruth Nash, and we drove over to Danby and met Mr. Harris at the country store. He took us up to where Miss Buck was living. It's just around the corner up the street. Took us in and introduced us to her. I was very young at the time, and she was in this very large wicker chair, sitting there with a beautiful gown on from China. I commented on it. She said it was from China. And I was very imposing, I must say. So she asked me some questions. My background, she asked me what we wanted to do with the video, and about what she thought that we should do, or what I thought we should do when we were there to do the taping. So I said that I would like her to talk a little about why she came to Danby, a little about what the town was like, maybe a brief tour, and a little about the antique center that she hoped to start. And I knew they were very anxious at that time to let people know that they were trying to build an antique center there in Danby. So when we finished, there was probably a 15-minute meeting. She wasn't one to visit a lot, and she said, we'll let you know. And that was a Saturday. And on Monday, the call came through. They wanted to do the interview as soon as possible. So on May 19th, we came from Burlington down to Danby. With me was John Donahue, who was the host for the interview. He was a Burlington Free Press reporter and did some hosting for us on public television. Then Lou Phillips, the cameraman, and Ron Clark was the audio man. We got there about 10 o'clock in the morning. Ted Harris met us, told Miss Buck we were there. He left. We never saw him the rest of the day. She came down, and it was a very, very hot day. She was wearing a beautiful green dress from China that reached to the ground, had a huge blue hat on that was made of straw to keep her face from the sun. And we started taping, and as I remember, there really wasn't a script. We sort of let her kind of talk about the town. She did a tour. She went to the Antique Center and talked to some of the people there. And again, she was all business, very courteous, but not a lot of chit-chat. And sort of how the tone of the day went, we were filming then with 16mm film. And not videotape, that wasn't even invented. So every 10 minutes you had to change the film. And we tried to arrange it so the film would end at a natural spot so we wouldn't have to break an interview. But one time it ended right at a very crucial spot. And we said, oh, no, no, no. So we had to change the film. And about 10 minutes later, John Donahue said, Miss Buck, you remember where we left off because we want to pick that interview up at that spot? And she said, Mr. Donahue, I know exactly where we left off. So that's how she was. She was very professional, wonderful mind, and a pleasure to work with. And when we were through, it was about 3 or 4 o'clock, and we were leaving, and she went into the country store. She thanked us, and I said, we were saying, I wonder if she liked what we did, and I wonder if she enjoyed working with us. And so she came out and with her book, The Good Earth, and on the way back, she handed to me on the way back. We were riding in the car, and I looked in the book, and it said, to Lynn Jarvis, with much appreciation, Pearl Buck, May 19, 1971. So then we knew she must have enjoyed our company and being there, and the video, I think, served the purpose at the time, and it's a real historic piece, and I hope you'll enjoy watching it. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm John Donahue, and today we're in Danby, Vermont. That's Marble Country, right in the center part of the state. And we have the rare opportunity of visiting the home of Miss Pearl Buck, the only woman ever to have won the Nobel and Pulitzer Prizes. I'm certainly glad to be here, Miss Buck, and delighted that you have permitted us to bring our cameras in for this very rare and wonderful occasion. You've been writing for some time. How have you managed to keep your public and your private life so separate?
I think mainly because my husband and I didn't want our children to grow up in the atmosphere of publicity. And we lived in the country very quietly as a result. So quietly that when one of my sons was about 9, he opened up an encyclopedia. I don't mean that he was given to reading the encyclopedia because he wasn't, but he happened upon my name there, and he came back to his father and said, why is Mother in that book?
Well, that's certainly understandable, but you've been able, to a remarkable degree, to keep your own professional integrity almost in one room, and your work in another room.
Well, my children understood that I had to work and must work, and they were very good about it. But I think the real answer is that I don't enjoy social events very much. I like to go to a friend's house occasionally, and I have had friends who understood that and didn't have big parties for me. Mm-hmm. And I don't do the usual social thing. I don't go to literary teas. I don't go to cocktail parties. You won't see my name in the social, in the newspaper columns of who was there wearing what. Not I. I am not there. Because I just don't enjoy it. I like different things.
Miss Buck, you've spent some 40 years in China and traveling elsewhere all around the world. All around us are souvenirs of those years. Could you tell us perhaps some special favorites you have and what they mean to you?
Yes, I think perhaps I would put the chess set first. That's an ivory chess set. I'm a great chess player, by the way, and I played chess with my mother till I went to college, and she never let me win once. And I've respected her for that very much.
What a great teacher.
Yes, right. If I won, it would have to be on my own abilities. And my children have learned chess from me, most of them. And so that chess set is a treasure.
Can they beat you?
What's that?
Can they beat you?
No, no, I wouldn't think of it. I wouldn't let them do that. And then, of course, the jade, little jade urn I treasure because it is a beautiful piece of jade, and it was given to me by Lin Yutang and his wife. Lin Yutang is a great Chinese writer.
Yes, indeed.
Now living in Taiwan, by the way. And the painting above there is one of a collection I have, really, by Chen Ji, who is the famous modern artist. He lives in New York, by the way, and is a very dear friend.
Is that watercolor?
Well, it's
or
a
is
sort of a watercolor. It's a tempera.
Right.
He has his own methods. After he's painted a picture, he pours water over it and sops it, and that gives that misty effect. And let's see, what else in the room? Oh, my old blue man from Korea.
He's quite a character.
Yes, he's a very important person. He doesn't really belong to me. He belongs to the household. And, of course, the screen behind me.
Yes.
That is a very fine piece. It's English, and it belongs to time of Charles II. And that's been in my house in Bucks County, and now here. And then, of course, I oughtn't to forget these. This one particularly, which
yes,
it doesn't look like anything, but it is the cut, the metal,
the
engraving piece that engraved the title onto the Good Earth in its first editions.
Right.
I suppose all of its editions, but my husband gave me that and the smaller one there that you see.
I'm delighted to hear that hardcover copies are now available. I've been looking for one for some time.
Yes, my publishers have supposed to have put all my books back into hardback.
Yes.
Publishers, you know, have to be pushed a little sometimes. Right. And I have a very fine and active, I won't say pushing, but something like that, business manager.
Of course, one time you didn't have to worry about that as long as your husband was your publisher.
But he's been gone now, dead for 10 years, so his son carries on. My stepson is very good.
Miss Buck, my research indicates that you've written at least some 83 books. This has kept you fairly busy. In the past year, you've been on 3 bestseller lists. What is it like to be a writer?
I don't know, because I've always been one. I've always written all my life long. I don't remember when I didn't write something, not thinking in terms of publication. I never thought of publication until I was 10 years after I finished college.
Yes.
My family on both sides are intellectuals. And my father's family was very famous for languages study. My father wrote many books. I can't go into the list of them because they were all had to do with Chinese subjects. He translated the New Testament from English from Greek into Chinese, ignoring the English, which he considered.
Bypassing the English, yes.
He thought it was imperfect, and he wouldn't have it. And my story, the Bible, by the way, is just out, which is a version of it is really a story. And I'm to give it to the American Bible Society on June the 4th.
How wonderful.
Yes, and my copy of my father's Bible is there in their rare archives, and this is to join that. And I'm so happy about that. I feel very pleased. I'm not sure he would approve this version, but I approve his, and that's more important at the moment.
Indeed it is. I wonder, Miss Buck, if it would be presuming if you would let us go and see where you do your writing.
Yes, I must say that I don't, that's an unusual request, but let's do it since we're in Danby.
Thank you very much. Love to go. This is a wonderful room, and you must have some very wonderful thoughts that have inspired the various phrases and expressions that you've had in your writing. I wonder if perhaps you'd be willing to read some of those favorite passages.
You read it.
It'll be a pleasure. I think perhaps the one that I first would like to read is from your Bridge for Passing, and it is the very end of the book, and I think it says a great deal for today and tomorrow. Science and religion, religion and science, put it as I may, they are two sides of the same glass, through which we see darkly until these two, focusing together, reveal the truth. On the day when the message comes through from over the far horizon, where dwells that great majority, the dead, the proof will reach us not as a host of angels in the sky, but as a wavelength recorded in a laboratory, a wavelength as indisputable and as personal as the fingerprint belonging to someone whose body is dust. Then the scientist, recognizing the wavelength, will exclaim, "But that's someone I knew. I took his wavelength before he died." And he will compare his record with the wavelength just recorded and will know that at last a device, a machine, is able to receive a message dreamed of for centuries, the message of the continuing individual existence, which we call the immortality of the soul. Or perhaps it will not be a scientist who receives, but a woman waiting at a window open to the sky. The other passage that is a special favorite of mine is from the biography that Ted Harris wrote, and it is embodied in your poem, Essence. I give you the books I've made, body and soul, bled and flayed, yet the essence they contain in one poem is made plain, in one poem is made clear. On this earth, though far or near, without love, there's only fear. I think those two touch me deeply. Perhaps they say more to you than they do to me.
Well, they're expressions of myself.
Right. To achieve such writing, almost as though they were etched, must require a considerable amount of discipline.
I don't think it's conscious discipline. I think the Chinese language helped me a great deal because it's very precise and concise.
Yes.
And then with any artist, self-discipline is absolutely essential, because nobody tells you when to start work. You don't have to go to your desk, you know. It's not 10 to 5 or 9 to 4 or anything like that. It's certainly an inner compulsion, not to produce books exactly, but to create something as perfect as you can. I had, as a matter of fact, a difficulty, though I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I was sorely tempted by music, because music is a very perfect art. And you can't cheat in music, you know. If you don't practice, everybody knows it, including yourself. And sculpture is another one that I had a very difficult time resisting. And I did do quite a bit of sculpture at one time. But the further I went in those, the more I believed that I must confine myself to writing, because it takes one life isn't enough to become finished in anything.
Well, in addition to your inner discipline, there must be some exterior discipline. Your desk certainly shows that.
Yes, I work on several things at one time, because sometimes a scene will come very clear for one book, and then...
What are you working on at the present?
Well, I never work on just one book, and just now I'm working on 3.
3 at one time?
Yes, very, very different ones, and it rests you sometimes. When you've been with one group of people too long, you're rested.
Can you tell us perhaps something about each of them, how far along they are? Or?
One is a study of, a story study, because I'm, you know, a storyteller.
Indeed.
And that book is not here. That book's in my home in Pennsylvania. When I go there, I usually work on that. Of the fact that however brilliant a young man is, and however great he may become, he is usually the one that is first killed in battle. The leader in life is also the leader in war. He leads the others, and so we have a tremendous loss of the best of our men. And then the two up here, one is from the point of view of a woman of my age, as you know, I have a considerable age, as she surveys her large family. She doesn't live with any of them, but they are celebrating her 70th birthday, and of course I should be going quite a bit further than that. And at that age, you are able to look at your children with great love, without criticism, with total acceptance, and considerable humor.
And that third book you're working on, you've been working on that for some time. What's that about?
I've been thinking about it for about 15 years and getting ready for it and doing research. I do a lot of thinking and planning before I begin, usually. And it is the challenge and the difficulty of a person, in this case it'll be a man, a boy, beginning with his birth, might almost say the too superior mind, the mind that is forever lonely because it doesn't find many companions and cannot find companions among average people. I think that democracy has a danger in it, in that envy is always present, you know, and people don't realize the tremendous discipline that's necessary to be an artist, and to not only be an artist, but to be a great scientist or a great any person. So that's the book I'm working on now, with the greatest intensity, perhaps.
Well, that certainly should be a fascinating book, considering the background that you bring to such a novel. Miss Buck, I've had the pleasure of seeing the village that you're working on here. Could you tell us some of the other projects that are dear to your heart, and then perhaps a word or two about what you're doing now?
Yes, I'm not a person for causes, you know, because a cause can absorb you, and I can't afford to be absorbed. But when I cannot get other people to do something that I think must be done, I have occasionally done it myself. For example, many years ago, I started the East and West Association, which brought Asians into American families, and the war stopped that. I started and carried on for a long time the very successful Welcome House Adoption Agency for children of American Asian parentage born in this country. I set up and to a degree directed the Pearl Buck Foundation, which Mr. Theodore F. Harris was the executive director, very able and brilliant man who's worked with me for many years in more than one project. And that now is set up and carries on very well of its own.
Its main purpose is what?
It is to provide some kind of opportunity and recognition for the children of American servicemen and Asian women who've been born since these years of war.
Right.
Because they have no citizenship. In Asia, they are considered the children of the father. The father's responsible. Of course, I've been many times to talk with the Pentagon and the State Department about them, and they say that legally they don't exist, but there are many thousands of them. And we are the only organization, the foundation is the only organization that specializes in them. And now, of course, that being set up and running very well, I have grown very much interested in this village of Danby, because I've never lived in a village, an American village, before.
Welcome to Vermont.
Thank you. So we're having a wonderful time now developing this as an antique center and country store. And Vermont's first millionaire built the old inn up here.
Well, how about taking us on a little tour of that?
Well, as a matter of fact, I was going to have to go anyway, and I'd love to have you go with me, and we can point out the waterfall and the buildings and so on, and the people.
Fine. I'd love to.
All right, fine. Here we are going down the street, and here are Raymond and Clyde, who are members of our construction firm. They grew up in the village, and they lived in one of the houses now being restored. They stopped work a minute, as you see, because I want you to meet them both. And now we let them go on with their work. And we walk down the street and to the bridge. You see, they're going right back to their work without a moment's delay while we walk to the bridge. And I always stop here at the bridge, no matter where I'm going, to look at our beautiful stream, our beautiful brook, Millbrook it's called, full of, I must say, the most delicious trout. We're going to put a bridge across because it was there originally, and it's to be glass on both sides. You see the waterfall, by the way, how lovely that is. And here's our house. It's almost finished. It's the 1825 house. And that's Bob, our electrician. Thank you, Bob, who opens the door to the Lismore Antiques. And here's Jim Farrell, and I'm sitting in one of his beautiful Filipino chairs. He has a wonderful collection of cranberry glass. I always love to look at his things. Of course, I'm not an expert on glass myself, but we have experts. We have a great deal of beautiful art glass in several of our stores. Jim Farrell has the whole downstairs of this 1825 house. And now we go to the 1836 house, which was the first house that we restored. You see these two old urns in front of it. Here are the children. They're here gathered to look at our old green parrot, 40 years old, and I must say quite bad-tempered. He's making up his mind about the children. I hope he doesn't say anything naughty. He's quite capable of it. And these buildings, by the way, house the Dandy Antiques Fair. But this, meanwhile, is Mary Jane Blumenthal's shop. And she has lovely jewelry, very tempting, because I love antique jewelry. And she's showing it to us now. I have to resist it. Every time I come, I resist, and then I yield and buy some lovely thing. Of course, it's natural for me to love antiques and beautiful things because I've lived most of my life in China, where I suppose there are more beautiful things and more old things than in any other country, perhaps, in the world. At least it's the country I know best for its beauty and its antiques. outside of our country store, 100 years old. So here's Dottie Rolfe, and I'm asking her, I'm going to ask her for a piece of cheese, Dottie, please. This good Vermont cheese, I can never resist it. And we give all our customers a taste. To tempt them, of course. We have every sort of country produce and in our store. Here's a shelf of books. Yeah, I'm going to take down this copy of...
Well, that was a good tour. Won't you join me, Miss Buck?
Thank you. I'd like you to have a copy of my new book.
Oh, how wonderful. The Story Bible.
Yes.
I've seen an ad just this week, I think, in the New York Times for it, and there's been some wonderful advance notices about that. New Testament, Old Testament, how did you happen to write the Story Bible?
Well, I enjoyed greatly when I was a child a book called Stories of the Bible. And so I thought it'd be nice to write one, not write one, but take stories from the Bible in sequence, which I've done here with the help of good researchers, I must say.
You're a grandmother. Do you see your grandchildren often?
Oh yes, I go very often to Pennsylvania to work in the foundation and to see my grandchildren. I have 12.
12?
12.
Oh.
Of varying degrees of naughtiness, now let me say.
Miss Buck, what about the young people today?
Well, they don't shock me so much as they do some older people, because I've been all through this before. When I was in China, the young people were going through exactly this same stage, even when I was young. They were rebelling against the government, and they were rebelling against the schools that they didn't have. They were rebelling against their parents because they wanted to choose their own husbands and wives instead of having the family choose them. And they were dressing differently, and so I've seen it all.
China's been close to your heart. What are your feelings about China today?
Well, I hadn't been there for a very long time, but two things encouraged me, because they're so typically Chinese. Not communists, but Chinese. One was the hijacking business. Remember when the hijacker got on the Filipino Red, a communist got on and thought he would be welcomed when the plane came down in Canton? Well, the Chinese didn't welcome him. They said in their usual superior manner, capital W, we do not approve of hijacking. And they put him on the plane with the passengers and sent him away again. And that ended hijacking. Now, no one had really thought of that.
How Chinese.
Yes, that was Chinese. And then the second, to be so gracious to the people that they had beaten at ping pong. Now, they don't take ping pong seriously. But they didn't want to begin at the top. That's not their policy. You begin with the child, the weak, the small. For example, if I wanted something of a Chinese friend of mine who was very high up, I would never go to him. I would say to my houseman, you go to his houseman and discuss the matter. And then when it had percolated through from the bottom to the top, then we would meet, you know, and he would casually say, my friend would casually say, wouldn't you like so-and-so? And I would say, it's very kind of you to think of it, if you are sure that it's all right, you see?
And you live, as this book ends, with hope.
Yes. Oh, yes, indeed. It isn't going to begin with Mr. Nixon going to see the Chinese. That I don't approve of. It has to move much more slowly than that, and through very different avenues. But things are beginning.
And will continue.
And will continue. And someday, very soon, not to say a year or 2 years, but very soon, as nations go, we'll be friends again.
Thank you very much, Miss Buck. There are a few great people in the world, but one of them is here in Danby, Vermont, Miss Pearl Buck, and we've had the pleasure of interviewing her for the past half hour. This is John Donahue.
So I would now like to introduce Representative Walter Freed, who also needs no introduction, who will take us through our program. Walter.
Thank you, Cadet. A special thanks to the Stratton Foundation for all their efforts that they put forth this weekend to bring this about, a ceremony honoring Pearl S. Buck's achievements internationally, nationally, here in Vermont for Vermont years, and today especially in Danby. And before we unveil this marker provided to us by the Division of Historic Preservation, I do want to point out that that it was certainly that instigation, the letter that I had received from Phyllis Landon, that your letter that I received requesting this, and also from Ingrid Halligan, who I see in the audience here, received a letter from them pointing out how appropriate it would be to have this historic marker prepared by the state of Vermont, and made that request. And our special thanks to the state and to John Dumville, who you both contacted to make that request and asked them to provide it. They did it in a very timely manner, shipped it down here, and I know there were numerous volunteers here in the community who put all the effort into having it erected here on this site. So it's certainly a tribute to all those volunteers who have participated today to make it possible. Before we actually unveil it, cut the ribbon, I do want to ask Edgar Walsh to please come up here, Edgar and Janice, as part of this ribbon cutting. But Edgar, I know you have a few remarks you'd like to make on behalf of Pearl.
Thank you, Walt, and I thank all of you for being here today, and thank the band and the people of Danby who welcomed Pearl Buck when she moved here so many years ago, and who took care of her in her last years. The family thanks you all. And I thought I would read a very brief passage from a letter that Pearl Buck wrote to a friend of hers in Vermont in 1955, 5 years after we first came to Vermont. And it speaks to Pearl Buck's love of humanity, and it's a personal letter. It's a copy, as Pearl Buck kept copies of most of her typewritten correspondence. And when I was going through the files this week, I came across it. And here's what she wrote to a friend who lived in Winhall. It takes age and much learning about life to understand the many kinds of people that there are in any community. Perhaps my years in China, perhaps my long years of work as a novelist, have taught me to appreciate all kinds of people, taking each personally as I find him or her, not expecting anything but what is given, not setting up any standards or tests, but just enjoying and appreciating what good there is, and there is always good. And I think that here in Danby, Pearl Buck found a lot of good people, and you're good people also. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Edgar. Now perhaps if you'd join us right up here.
Get us on one side, Edgar, and on the other side here. This is your photo op right here. I'm going to get out of the way.
I'll hold you.
Yes.
You do the cutting.
You want me to cut the blue? Cut the blue. Okay, cut the middle part.
There you go. There you go.
beautiful marker for all to see. Thank you so very much, Janice and Edgar. Now we'll hear again a selection from the Courier Memorial Band. That's made up of students from both Danby and Mount Tabor. It's good to have you here. Courier Memorial School and the members of the band. As it was pointed out, actually, if you look at this sign here, you'll note that tomorrow would have been the birthday for Pearl Buck. What an appropriate birthday present this is. Now, on an informal basis, I think what we'll attempt to do is to go over some of the properties that Pearl Buck owned here in Danby. And I've got a brief narrative on them. We'll keep it on an informal basis where then some of the members here of the audience, members of the community that want to share some comments that certainly they're far better versed as to these properties than I am, can share with those gathered. But to start with, we'll start with what is right now the Vermont Country Birdhouses building. It's a yellow building right here. This is now the home of Vermont Country Birdhouses. This was the first property that Miss Buck purchased in Danby in 1969. It was previously known as the Abe Rosen Store. The building has a history dating back to 1862. That was when it was the Silas Griffiths General Store, and the store was closed in the early 50s until purchased by Miss Buck. While under the care of Miss Buck, it was called a country store. The store carried all sorts of novelties and hard-to-find items. It was managed by Tom Leopold. Tom's wife, Phyllis, ran the Maple Skillet, a restaurant in the north corner of the store where locals and tourists came to eat and to visit with Miss Buck in a casual surrounding. The second floor held an antique shop. One room was dedicated to Miss Buck's books, and during her stay in Danby, she ran a promotion of her books. They were white leather bound and numbered and autographed and were promoted as her birthday edition. Her executive officers were on the third floor, and she used her office to write and hold meetings. Now, I know that Cecile Strauss, her father's, this was her father's property, and maybe she'll also tell you a little bit more about the yellow building. Cecile?
Okay. I'm Cecilia Rosen Strauss, born and raised in Danby. I went 9 years to school here, and then I left and went away to a private school and to Barnard College, and did my 3 years of graduate work at Columbia and ended up teaching at the City University. My my father had this general store here. Can you all hear me? Okay, he had this general store. He owned the building. It was built by Silas Griffith, and it dates back to around 1850. As a youngster growing up, we came here I was always here from the summertime, and I helped in the store. I waited on customers, and on Wednesday afternoon, the people who worked in the quarry would come down in droves with their checks for the week's wages. They made $23.76 a week, and that was their weekly salary to run for their family. And we used to go to Rutland the day before and get a couple $1,000s in cash to cash those checks. My father passed away in the 50s, and I had the store available for a long time. I finally decided to paint and alter it, and I ran an ad in the Rutland Herald called White Elephant for Sale. We'll sell with $1,000 down payment. And we were waiting and looking for a customer, and in came Pearl Buck with two young men who were her assistants. And they looked at the store, and before they walked out, they had given me a check as a deposit for the $1,000. The balance is about, I think, $5,000 or $6,000 for the whole building. And the thing I wanted to say about Pearl Buck is in all my teaching experiences, I don't believe I've ever met any woman who stood out the way Pearl Buck did. She was remarkable, friendly, well-spoken, and charming. I have a few more notes here. In the store, we sold everything that you can imagine, anything a family could want. Silas Griffith had it originally as a store. And we sold gasoline. There was a Texaco pump. There's a kerosene tank still over there. And we sold inside groceries, shoes, pharmacy, hardware, shotgun shells, underwear, nails, carpentry work. And my father, as a young man, delivered groceries to the quarry, horse and wagon, and then later on with a Ford truck. And then he also delivered to Danby Corners and to Mount Tabor, because the people did not have cars and they needed somebody to come to them with their orders. They would order it on Monday and he'd bring it on Tuesday. And that's the way the week went. And Pearl Buck, when she took over the store, it was just such a pleasure to me because she was such an unforgettable lady. She bought several other houses in Danby. She bought several other houses in Danby. And these houses that you see here, this was Joe Badger's house. The next house beyond the store was Libby Griffiths, and she boarded a lot of the teachers in Danby. And this was Eli Hibbard's, and over here, that was Miss Weeks' ice cream parlor. Danby had more business centers then. Across where the Catholic Church is now was a hotel, Ackert's Hotel, and they were a very big family, and that burned down, and that came and took its place. And I want you to know that Miss Buck invited me to her house. She moved around the corner and up the hill, and she invited me to dinner there several times. And she was friendly and nice, and frankly, in all my worldwide experiences, she is probably the number one as far as remarkable women that I have met. I had her at lunch at my house, and I do want to say that when I heard that she had bought it, and that there were lights on in every room at night after many years of it being dark, I was thrilled. I just sat in my car and wept. and I thank you for listening to me. And it's been a pleasure to see so many people come and look at the building that I was born and raised in until I went away to school. Thank you.
Thank you, Seal. What a great job. The next property is the Gallery at Danby Green. And Quebec talked about competing with a milk truck. The Gallery at Danby Green, the gray building here, Mabel Stevens owned the second house that Miss Buck bought. Obadiah Hadwin built this house. Hadwin had a mill that used the water power provided by the brook. Mabel Stevens had a for sale sign in the window. Her daughter, Seal, remembers Miss Buck and Mr. Harris coming to see the house one afternoon. Miss Buck purchased the 14-room house for $10,000 back in 1969. And this house is now the home of the Gallery at Danby Green. Now I know that I think Seal Colvin is here, perhaps, and would like to say a few words about this property. Hope I'm not putting you on the spot.
Yes, you are. Well, I'm not a public speaker, as you will all find out. But yes, my daughter and I were sitting on the lawn here one afternoon, and Ted Harris and Miss Buck came. They looked at the country store. I was under the impression that they had already purchased the country store. They walked over. Miss Buck commented how gorgeous this child was and asked me if my house was for sale. I said, well, it's not my home, it's my mom's, but yes, it is for sale. And they did purchase the home. And then after Miss Buck was here in town, I was cleaning the antique shops for them. And she, after seeing my work, asked me if I would like to come and clean her home for her. And I did this with great joy, and I mean, I was just, love this lady, and it has been the most exciting thing in my life to have met her and worked with her, and miss her very much. And this, she brought Danby to life, and it was a very, very exciting time for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Seal. The next two properties, the old Perry House and next door the Enchanted Planter, the old IGA store. The third property was purchased in 1969, the old Perry House here, and was consisted of two houses, one on either side of the brook. The corner store, now the Enchanted Planter, was originally Perry's harness shop, was built around 1855. The Perrys ran the shop and lived next door in the house with a bay window. A bridge over the brook connected the shop with the house. The building has been the home of an IGA, Ed Raish's meat shop, and an ice cream parlor. When Miss Buck bought the building, it was empty. Miss Buck had much love and concern for the youth of the community and was hoping to turn this building into a youth center. The Wilcox House, it's around the corner on the right, behind the tree. You notice that you venture around the intersection here. It was located on Mount Tabor Road. For those of you who aren't familiar, where Mount Tabor is located in Danby, the town line is partway down this road here. And actually Route 7, I know so many of you traveling through this area think that that's Danby over there. It's not, it's Mount Tabor where you're on Route 7. But on the Mount Tabor Road, this property was built in 1868. Miss Buck purchased the property from Morris Belden. Wendy and Alan Coughlin lived in the house and converted the first floor into an antique shop. Alan had a fancy for old bottles and frog figures, and his collection was on display and for sale.
We're going to move now because the next house that we'll look at is around the corner, and Walt will tell us a little bit about that before we leave, but I just wanted to give you the rest of the schedule because I'm the schedule person. We'll walk up, try to stay as far into the, as far out of the road as you possibly can, since we know the ambulance is already busy.
Well, it's just a short walk, a little bit uphill, but just around the corner here to what was Pearl Buck's own house. Then we're going to come back here, and right behind the gallery at Danby Green is a beautiful green area by the waterfall, and this table will magically be back there, and we'll have some cold drinks for everybody, and just a couple of quick closing remarks and thank yous. And then for those of you who plan to join us for brunch at the Silas Griffith Inn, we'll just walk from here right up to the inn. Any questions? And if you hadn't planned on joining us for brunch and you'd like to, maybe you would see Barbara McCarty, who's raising her hand back there, so we get a good count for the Gaines family. And I also wanted very much to thank the whole Danby committee of the Pearl S. Buck Symposium. Ingrid and Bill Halligan did a masterful job. Bill was the one who put the post in for the sign. Brad Bender, who has been instrumental. Andy Rothman, who owns the building here. Georgia Labatt, who couldn't be with us today, and Pam Fuller, and then the Gaines family from the Silas Griffith Inn. They all played a big role in making today such a special day. So, Walt, tell us a little bit about the house, and then we'll head up.
How about a big round of applause for all those volunteers? The next two properties, I'll describe them, and then we'll kind of go on a walking tour. But the first one we're going to see is actually what Pearl Buck called home, and it's around the corner, and it's going to be up here on the left. This was a property that Miss Buck called home. The building had a marble company store and was built in 1862. The trees have grown and blocked the view, but during Miss Buck's ownership, this 3-floor house overlooked the mountains and the brook and the waterfall that could be seen from the back of the house. Miss Buck had her kitchen in the front of the house off the porch. Once one passed through the kitchen, there was a dining area and a music room where she had a baby grand piano. The second floor held Miss Buck's living room, dressing room, master bedroom, and Mr. Harris had an apartment who lived on the 3rd floor. Danby residents tell stories of Miss Buck dressed in one of her many colorful dresses, putting out her summer flowers and greeting and smiling at passers-by. So after we visit that property, then walk back down the street to show you the last of the buildings is the old post office building, right across the street from Nichols Store. It's this yellow building here. Miss Buck also owned the old post office building across from Nichols Store. While under her ownership, the downstairs remained a post office and the rest of the building housed her employees. These buildings are all part of the Danby Village Historic District. They were listed on the National Register of Historic Places on February 10th, 1983. So with that, why don't we gather and go around the corner. We'll go up to visit Pearl Buck's house.